Hey y'all, welcome to the Coyote Trapping School podcast. I'm your host, Chris Pope. In this episode, as I've been thinking about trapping season coming up, and I've got doing a little nuisance beaver work and things, not my favorite, but during the summertime anyway, but got thinking about otters, and that's one thing we haven't really talked about in depth. If you followed along on any of my trap line videos, I catch some otters every year, and I like to catch otters, and I'm no specific otter trapper. I guess it's been about 15 years or so ago now. Otter prices just went through the roof, and particularly for southern otters, because of our southern otters tend to have a pale throat and chest, and for whatever reason that was kind of the trend, that was kind of the style, and so especially our southern otters, man, 100 to 150 bucks was the going rate, and that's unheard of for any southern fur, and so there was a lot. There was guys that were heavily targeting otters, and specifically otters, and so folks picking up roadkill otters and things like that. So I guess I say all that to say I've never targeted. Y'all know, if you followed me, I'm not a one critter trapper to begin with. When I go onto a property, as long as I got permission to catch everything from the landowner, that's my game plan. I want to catch everything. If there's fox, coyote, coons, beavers, otters, whatever, I want to try to catch it all. Just because, to me, it's kind of, I enjoy the different aspects of it. I enjoy the kind of the variety of water trapping and land trapping, and how that kind of keeps you engaged through the process and the different catches and all, and not knowing what you're going to get. But I also feel like it's kind of helping me to be more efficient, instead of going down to another property and setting more land sets. I'm covering kind of all my bases, and if you're in the fur market, if you're trapping and selling your furs, which most of you probably are, I assume you are, you're probably not counting on it for a lot of money wise, but you probably are trying to at least move your furs to make a little bit. I kind of think of it as diversifying your portfolio too. If you got 20 coyotes or whatever, your focus is coyotes, and that's all you caught was mainly coyotes and a few foxes and stuff here and there. And because the coyote market's been hot, you never know when that's going to change, and boom, overnight coyotes are out, and what's next. And so if you got a handful of coyotes and some otters and beavers and coons and things like that, maybe it sets you up. But like I said, there's just so much uncertainty in the fur market. It's hard to go from year to year and count on one thing being like that, because when it's hot, everybody knows that it's hot, and everybody's targeting that, which tends to make it not so hot, right? Because you got oversupply. So anyway, we'll get into that more. But like I said, I was just thinking otters, and figured we'd talk a little bit about otters. So I did a little study and a little research on kind of biology and behavior, and honestly, there's not a whole lot of good, I guess I would say, data on otters. Otters, I guess maybe they're not as sexy as like wolves or larger predators that get a lot of attention, and they don't cause as many problems. They're not as visible as say coyotes, and so they don't get as much attention that way. So it's kind of hit or miss on the information, the legitimate researched information that you can find on otters. But typically otters are pretty social, and you'll hear that, you'll see that. You talk to trappers, you read trapping books. If they're talking otter trapping, they're talking gang setting, because a lot of times otters are traveling in family groups. And so what that'll be is, that's and I got this just from doing a little research. Typically that's the mother, the adult female, and her young. And you'll see that when you catch them. You can tell the difference between a large otter and a small otter. And when you catch a group of them, there's going to be some smaller ones in there. But typically the breeding size males, they'll tend to be kind of on their own, a little more solitary than the family groups. But it's not uncommon to see 2, 3, up to 6 or 7 or more otters, and depending on where you are. When I was in southeast, or when I was in South Alaska, working in Prince William Sound, we see groups of 10 or more otters. I mean, they're just river otters now, coastal river otters, and I mean, that's just how they operate. That's how they work. I think they probably use that group mentality and effectiveness when hunting, and targeting whatever they eat, whether that's fish or they got a pretty wide diet. But they are obviously aquatic, so they spend most of their time in the water. Definitely not afraid to get out of the water and go. I remember one year when I was living in North Florida, I was bow hunting, and it was a particularly dry year. And I was, if you're familiar with the South, you know that a lot of the rural areas are timberland, and so you've got your hardwood drains and your hardwood bottoms, and then outside of that it's planted pines. And so if you catch it, you may have super thick planted pines, and a lot of times those hardwood drains are the edges of the hardwood and the pine are the better travel ways. They're easier for you to access too, because if it's a young pine stand, it's tough to get around in there and you got no visibility. But it was a larger creek, and I hear something coming, and the leaves were dry. Like I said, it was dry. The creek was low, real low, and it was 2 otters just coming in there loafing along. They're really funny to watch. They're weird looking when they move, because they kind of move like a super fast inchworm or something. It's flat hump, flat hump, flat hump. But that's really about the only time, other than seeing where they get out of the water and come back in. That's about the only time that I can think of that I've seen them on dry land traveling like that. They do tend to be wide ranging, and I couldn't find any good statistics or details. I did see one stat that said that their home range can be up to 60 square miles. So I was gonna just so that's 40,000 acres. That's pretty substantial. But they're going to be traveling waterways, and so they may be coming down a river and then cutting up a big creek, cutting over to another creek, and typically, I don't know that I've seen any research to back it up, but you'll hear trappers talking about the otters and their circuits, and they kind of have a circular home range. At least the idea is they have a circular home range, and so they'll come down this big creek and then jump over and come through these ponds, and then work back around and kind of work through their home range like that. And so I know a lot of times I've heard in trapping circles, again, you get around conventions and stuff, folks talk about they'll come through every 21 days or something like that. I don't know that there's any validity to that specific of a time frame. Animals are animals, and they will come through when they come through, and if there's good hunting over here, they may stay longer, and if there's this pond's dry or just been fished out or whatever, then they may come through faster. So but that we'll touch back on that time frame here in a little bit. In fact, let me make a note about that. I got a note right here. Good. So large home ranges, and I saw one place said that they've recorded one male otter traveling, and typically the males tend to travel more distance, longer ranges than the females. One male otter traveling 10 miles in one night, which is definitely a lot. You think about it, but if that otter's, if he's on a big river, that's really not that outstanding of a feat. If he's swimming and going with the river current, or even a larger creek, if he's got some current with him, I mean, it's not, you can kayak 10 miles in a day pretty. I don't want to get too far out, but that's not an unreasonable feat, I guess. So the bottom line is though that they're wide ranging. They cover a lot of ground. One interesting thing about them is, like all weasels, I didn't realize this, but all weasels, they with their breeding season and all, they have what's called delayed implantation. So the females are actually bred in the spring, but those eggs aren't. Let's see. I don't know when the fertilization occurs, how that works. Anyway, the eggs don't start maturing into embryos until the following winter or early spring. And then they've got like a 60 to 65 day gestation period, in the early spring, and then the pups are usually born March to May, some time frame like that. So that's pretty interesting. That I mean, you're looking at it's not your typical breed in January, pups in March, and all that. It's breed in March. Next January, eggs are fertilized, and you're having your pup. So that's kind of unique, pretty interesting. One thing that I was going to talk about is with the research. I mentioned research, and I say there's not a lot of there's research, but it's very spread out, especially in the southeast. There's not a lot of focus. But actually, the first time I got to go to Alaska was because of a river otter research project, and so that was definitely, I appreciated that. Kind of a caveat is that kind of gave me an even worse taste for research, because what we were looking at was it was neat to be a part of. We were living on an island in Prince William Sound, and there were these otter latrines or otter toilet locations around the island, and we actually went and mapped those locations, to the extent where we could see river otter usage, and took soil samples and foliage samples, trying to see it from the toilet location, then also off the site, and trying to see how those river otters may be impacting, those kind of micro environments, how that increased activity, scat, and such, may be impacting those. And I've never honestly looked to see what the results of that research was. I was just a technician, so I was a boat driver and fix-it man. I wasn't and I did a lot of the compass and clinometer work for mapping and things, but I didn't have any of the data analysis, thank goodness. But that kind of gave me a bad taste about research, just because, in my opinion, that was pointless research. What good does it do you to know that otters, are putting, so much nitrogen back into the soil? How's that applicable? Where's that ever going to get used? And there's a lot of, you're talking tens of thousands. That was a multiple year project. There's probably hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on that project. And I don't know, that just gave me a bad I'm all about research, and I'm good with research if we can use it for something. But that's a side tangent. Anyway, I did appreciate the river otter research that I was involved with, though, just because it got me into Alaska, and really in a remote part of Alaska, to experience pretty awesome experience, and see a lot of otters. That's one place where you think coastal areas, you don't necessarily think of river otters, and we saw some sea otters, but there's no intermingling, no intermixing. Those coastal otters, they're staying pretty close to the shoreline, and it's big groups of them. It's pretty neat to see. All right, back down, kind of tying in with that. Populations and regulations, I guess, across the U.S. are pretty varied. So in the southeast, there are very healthy river otter populations. I don't know of any states in the southeast that have any restrictions on otter trapping. So if there's no restrictions on otter trapping, that tells me there's no concern about the populations. They're very robust and doing good, healthy populations. I had another thing I was going to tie in with that. My mind gets going faster than my mouth, and then I forget. The one thing, what I was thinking was, though, a lot of people don't realize that, because otters are primarily nocturnal, and they focus, they spend a lot of time around the waterways. So you get folks in the city that don't ever get out or spend that time outdoors, and even if they do take a drive through the country, they can see the deer and the turkeys, and they see the coyotes in the city, but they don't see otters. So it throws them for a loop. Everybody thinks, for whatever reason, everybody thinks any kind of wildlife, it seems, is endangered to begin with, and but even more so, river otters, because they got them in the aquariums that you can go see, and they're all cute and cuddly, and so but regardless of people's perception, fact is, river otter populations, like I say, particularly in the southeast, are very healthy. Now, there's other states where there's restrictions on harvest or there is no harvest, and there's been a lot of efforts over the last few years, or over probably the last 20 years or more, to relocate otters and get populations established in areas where there used to be otter populations, but there no longer are. And you want to know how that's done? It's done with foothold traps. Number 11 double long spring foothold traps is how a lot of those otters are caught. So there again, you got the folks that are saying trapping's bad. This is damaging to the animals, harmful to the animals. This is torture, and yet that's the most effective way to catch those animals, to take them and establish new populations. Explain that one to me. Anyway, and I was listening, I think it was a Meat Eater podcast the other day, and it was the National Wild Turkey Federation. They were actually talking about trading wildlife because of the Lacey Act. You can't put a dollar value on wildlife crossing interstate lines and things. So that's the way that's done between states. Is this state says, well, I need turkeys, and this state says, well, I got turkeys, I need otters, and so they do a swap like that. And from what I've seen and read, those otter relocation programs have worked very well to get populations established and flourishing. And every year it seems like the trapping regulations are kind of loosening up more and more as those otter populations expand. So that's definitely a big win. One thing that I thought was interesting, talking about podcasts, I was listening to the Wolfer Nation podcast, Clint Locklear's podcast, and he had Chip Davis in Mississippi on, and they were talking about otters and mink. And that's one thing, if you followed me any, that's my fur bear that I'm after. I've never caught a mink, and that's really what I'm after. And Chip was saying that he feels like that in the areas with good otter populations, there's not very good mink populations, and vice versa. And that, to me, that kind of makes sense. They're both weasels, and mink's just kind of a smaller otter, not quite as aquatic, but not afraid to get his feet wet either. And as long as I've been trapping in Georgia, otters have been rocking and rolling, good populations, and I've seen a couple of mink on the coast, and that's it. But you think about some of your mink states up north, a lot of those places don't have the otter populations. Or, in my mind, and I'm no mink research expert, but a lot of the things, articles and stuff that I've read and seen on mink trapping, it's on smaller creeks that probably aren't as likely to get used by otters to begin with. So that was just something I thought kind of interesting and neat. Moving on to talk about damage and human-wildlife conflicts with otters, so to speak. Typically, that's not really an issue. You run into any fisherman, pretty much, or somebody with a farm pond or a pond that they manage for fish. They are no fans of the otters. The way that otters come through, I don't know how much of an impact otters are having. There's no doubt that otters do have the potential to have huge impacts if it's a large group of them, and maybe the fishing is exceptionally good and they stay there. Where you can get into more of it is in aquaculture settings, fish farming settings, where that otter figures out, he rolls in and comes into these ponds. It's, man, this is like catching fish in a barrel. There's catfish everywhere, and I can eat to my heart's content, and I don't ever have to go anywhere. So there are definitely situations where trapping has to be done, removal of the otters has to be done because of damage that they are causing. They can have impact, but it's not as visible. Their sign is not like beaver sign where you walk down the creek and you see it out everywhere. But so from that aspect, they're not as visible, not as noticed as other animals. There again, talking about the research, I saw one thing that said a large otter can consume 2.5 fish a day. I saw another one that said otter can, I think it was on a Mossy Oak site, in one of the Mossy Oak sites, an otter can consume 10 to 20 pounds of fish a night. That's ridiculous in my mind. I'm no otter researcher, I'm no otter expert, but you're talking about, another thing was, it talked about, males weighing up to 30 pounds and females 20 to 30 pound range. I've never caught a 30 pound otter. some of the bigger otters I've caught have been pushing 20 pounds, 22 pounds. 30-pound otter is like a 50-pound coyote, in my opinion. It's, yeah, people don't carry a scale with them, or they've never even touched an otter to me if they're talking about 30-pound otters. I'm sure there's some big otters, and the one thing I would say that's probably a little bit deceiving about otters is they're not very big. Man, they're just solid. They're solid muscle, and so from that standpoint, they can weigh probably more than they look like. But that's a pretty big discrepancy, 2.5 pounds to 20 pounds. I don't think an otter's eating 20 pounds of fish a night. He may kill, you know, there may be instances where an otter gets happy-go-lucky in a catfish pond and just kills 20 pounds of fish, maybe, but I don't see an otter being able to move if he eats 20 pounds of fish a night. Talking about eating, another thing, you know, otters don't just eat fish. They're like so many other things. They're opportunists, man. They'll eat crawfish, frogs, ducks, snakes. I mean, if it's in the water, they'll eat it. Mink, I think, or maybe not mink, but marten and beavers probably, especially smaller beavers. They're opportunists. They're going to eat whatever they can get their hands on, you know. Like I was saying before, there's not a lot of, otter don't put off the sign like beavers or other critters do. So that's yet another reason why people don't realize they're around like they are. To me, the most common place to look for otter sign is if you've got a pond dam, you walk that pond dam and look for little piles of fish bones and fish scales. And if you're looking hard enough, you can usually see a little trail going across that dam. And if you can find that trail, walk back and forth around it, because that's where the scales are going to be. That's otter scat, and you know, that's your dead giveaway. If there's otters using that, I would say 99% of the time there's going to be some scat. That, you know, that may be a toilet location on that pond dam. And then also, you know, they'll just as quickly, if you're on rivers or creeks. You know, I've been paddling on rivers and come up on a sandbar and get up in the willows right off the edge of the sandbar, and, you know, have a big old water toilet with otter scat everywhere. So, but to me, you know, looking for those crossovers and, you know, tracks in sand and mud, and then, you know, trying to find those toilet sets. Those are about all you're left with when looking for sign. So getting on into trapping, like I started with, the majority of my catch is, I don't necessarily want to say incidental, but it's kind of in conjunction with, maybe a better word, because I do when I'm setting beaver sets, and when I'm in a water area setting water traps, I'm always looking for otter sign, and if I see otter sign, I'll set. And then, you know, if I can find a place, one of the places this last year where I caught an otter was it was on a larger creek, and there was a good channel and a log. I mean, it was picture perfect dive set scenario. Big log, and I stuck my H stand right there. The conibear rested just underneath the log, perfect. And I caught a couple beavers and an otter there. You know, I was hoping for the otter there too. I knew that was a good location. Whatever came through there, I was going to catch. And so that's what I would say is, when you're beaver, if there's otters in the area, if you're beaver trapping and you stay in an area long enough, you got a good chance of catching them incidental to targeting your beavers. But there are also things that you can do to try to target otters in addition while you're beaver trapping. So we'll get into that. Firstly, though, I was going to talk about traps. So 90% of the time when I'm water trapping and I'm setting, you know, if I'm targeting otters on water trapping, I'm running my number 5 bridgers on a drowning rod or a drowning cable anyway. So that's kind of what I default to. It's a good beaver trap for their beaver's large back foot. Otters don't have near those size feet, but that trap is still a good strong trap, and it'll hold them just fine. You can get by with smaller traps for sure, and I do on occasion set some MB550s. It's been several years ago now, but I read an article about a guy that found a kind of a crossover between a couple creeks or something where otters were using, and he used, you know, basically a predator set, like a dirt hole set, up there on the hill on the dry ground with like probably a number 2 size trap or 550s. I can't remember what he was running, but and he was catching otters like that. Biggest thing there is make sure you got swivels, because them things are and make sure it's staked well, because they're going to try it. I mean, they're going to give it as much of a go as a coyote would. I mean, they're aggressive, and they're going to work it. So the last 2 seasons I have tried some kind of variations of that when I found some sandbars where there was some, kind of it was a little bit smaller area, but some sandbars where there was kind of toilets and some otter activity, and I put in, staked down an MB550, and then put a couple punch holes around with some crawfish oil, some otter gland, some kind of fishy coon bait, just anything I could that I knew would try to catch an otter's attention. And that's kind of, I was going to hit on this later, but my go-tos if I'm water trapping, and there's anywhere I water trap, there's a good chance of catching otters. So I've always got with me otter gland lure and crawfish oil. Those 2 things that I know of, they're kind of the best way that I've found of targeting and trying to kind of call in otters to your sets, whether you're putting your otter gland and a castor mound or what. I've had really good success using both of those. Not necessarily all the time paired together, but either or together in catching otters. And I'll get into that a little bit more. Talking about traps, though, the next thing, if your conibears is another very popular. When you're water trapping, that's a good way to catch beavers. That's a good way to catch otters. If you're just targeting otters, really a 220 is a really good size trap for an otters, because they are smaller built and they move so fast. That being said, from my perspective, and I've caught beavers in 220s, but when you look at a beaver, a full-grown beaver, and you look at a 220, and I've caught beavers going through 220s, and I'm sitting there thinking, how in the world did he think he was going through there? I mean, it's 220 will definitely catch a beaver. Don't get me wrong, but that's not ideal for a beaver. And so what I've transitioned to, let me kind of go around that. So, typically beaver conibear traps, you're talking 330s. Because, like I said earlier, otters are so small and kind of move so fast, I don't tend to favor a 330, because if you don't have your trigger wires just right, there's still a lot of room for an otter to shoot through there. Maybe not a lot of room, but there's definitely still room for an otter to shoot through there and never fire that trap at all. So you'll catch otters definitely in 330s. A lot of times you're probably going to see more body catches with in 330s than you're going to see the ideal, right behind the head and neck catch. So that's one important reason why anytime you're setting conibears, period, but especially with otters, you need to stake that thing good, because if you don't get a perfect behind the head catch, and it takes a minute, if you don't get that perfect catch, you don't want to lose your setup. So you've got to be sure you get that thing staked so that you don't lose all your gear. So that being said, I don't run any 220s, just because I like versatility with my traps. And like I said, you can definitely catch beavers in 220s, but I run about half and half 280s and 330s. The 280 I found is a pretty good, in my opinion, it's a pretty good mix of, a good beaver. I catch a lot of beavers in 280s. It's a little bit bigger, but then it's also will hammer the otters. And then, I get harassed a little bit for being a trap snob, but all of my conibears that I run are Belials. At the very least, I would recommend, in my opinion, Magnum traps. So traps that have the Canadian style bend in the jaw, so that the jaws come all the way together. That, in my opinion, that's the only way to go, as long as it's legal. And I don't know anywhere where that's not legal for conibears, but in my opinion, that's the only way to go, just because of the assurance of holding that catch. And like I said, with otters, the way they go through so fast, you can get a tail catch. You can get odd catches that if you don't have a trap that closes together completely, you're not going to keep that otter. And I was just trying to think. I don't know that I've ever had a tail catch with an otter like that, but I've had a lot of beavers that I've caught by the tail, by the leg, but because I was using those belials, they closed completely. I still got that beaver, and I'm not sitting there with an empty trap wondering what came through. So, just my 2 cents. I am a fan of investing in your equipment and making sure that you got the best equipment. When I'm out there, I want to catch game, and I don't want to. I guess I've learned that through experience. I started out with used conibear Duke traps and things, that that I saw the misses, I saw the no catches and things, and from that, and then seeing the catches that I can, the things that I can hold with my my belials, I gladly spend the extra money to get in my opinion, the extra quality. Just my 2 cents on that. All right. So, one thing in thinking about, if you're in areas where you can't legally trap otters, and if you're beaver trapping, there's going to be times when you do incidentally catch an otter, and you got to know what your regulations are. You're probably going to need to call your local game warden and take the otter to them so they can, they can take it. And I've never had that happen because of our regulations here, but in most cases, I think as long as you come forth with that, I mean, that there's the expectation that there is going to be some of that incidental catch. So that's not going to be a blemish against you, the trapper. But one thing that you can do is, maybe try to use more of those 330s if you're trying to avoid otters. I would say you could set your trigger in a kind of an L shape and put it to one side of the trap so that there's a bigger space for the otter to get through. And I'm just kind of spitballing here because I've never tried to avoid otters. But I've seen a lot of different variations on how to set your trigger, and I would say that would be one that, if you got it in a good beaver run, even if it's off to the side in the L shape, that beaver's still probably on it, whether it's on the top or the bottom. The beaver's still big enough to hit that and fire it, but an otter, he may be able to slide through and never miss a lick. But one thing you can do is use beaver snares, relaxing lock beaver snares, because the opening on those things is so large, the otter's usually going to go through and not have any problem. In fact, what I found is sometimes if you're running beaver snares and you go up and your snare's pulled down about this big, in my experience, and I don't have anything to back this up, but what I've been told and what I've kind of seen, that's most likely an otter that went through there. He just blew through the snare and pulled it down tight, but he came through so fast and quick he was gone before the snare even thought twice. So that is something to think about if you're trying to avoid catching otters, but you're beaver trapping. If snares are legal, that can be a good way to try to avoid otters. You can actually snare otters, and I did try when I lived in Florida. There's no trapping. You can use snares and you can use cage traps, and so I did mess around with some snares for otters. I used to have one hanging around. Excuse me. I did order some otter snares, specifically otter snares from New Sterling, and they are a loaded, very fast, small snare. It's actually got a barrel swivel, so it's got a short length of cable, barrel swivel, and then another short length of cable. And that second short length of cable is basically your loop. That's your opening. So it opens up. That's your opening, and then you've got a swivel, you got another piece of cable, another swivel, and then I put another swivel in addition to that. And the only experience I had, I can't help but think that I caught an otter, and he still, he got that snare to bind, kinked it, and got out. So if that's all you got to use what you got, what you can. But snaring for otters wouldn't be my top choice. In saying that, I do think there's some guys. So I've talked about him before, I think, but Lightning Trap Company. He's a guy in Florida that builds cage traps, and I've seen some pictures where he seems like he's pretty successful catching otters in cages. In my perspective, I've never done it, but I wouldn't see otters as being super cautious about entering a cage. I don't think. They're very, from what I've seen and read, they're going to invest. They're very curious. They're going to investigate if there's a beaver lodge, something like that. They're going to go in and check it out. So, I think that is a option if you got a larger cage trap, again, otters, they're going to be rough on your stuff, so you got to make sure that you that thing's loaded for bear, so to speak. But I do think that is an option if you're in Florida maybe and you don't have a foothold or conibear option. So where are you going to set your traps? For the most part, it's going to be kind of like beaver trapping. You know, you're sitting in runs, you're sitting in good dive set locations. If you've got a toilet, you know, set the slides going onto that toilet. One location that I really like is setting beaver. If it's legal in where you live, and you can set a conibear right at the lodge entrance, you got a little bit better chance of catching small beavers if they're in there. But I've caught a lot of otters right at beaver lodges. I've even got some trail camera video and caught some otters on lodges that were large enough that I could set a foothold on the outside of the lodge on a drowner. I've caught otters like that. For whatever reason, I guess it's, you know, everything likes the smell, likes the meat of a beaver, and then you mix in, it's got openings and holes and things like that. The beaver lodges seem to be otter magnets, so I would put beaver lodges high on the list if I could find them, or any kind of hole in the bank den, things like that seem to be really attractive to otters. Crossovers, if you can find a good crossover, that's definitely a good place to set your runs. Beavers, otters, I think, are very fenceable, so to speak. You know, just like beavers, if you've got a good run, or if you've got a log over the creek and you need to fence that down to make it the opening just small enough for your conibear, I'd do that. You've got a good chance. I still think you're going to catch an otter. Otters aren't going to bat an eye at working that fencing and going through your traps. One thing that I'll do a lot to try to kind of specifically target otters, like I said, I always got my otter gland and I always got crawfish oil, but I'll either on a slide itself, I'll just take a piece of rebar and just put a little punch hole in the bank and throw me some otter gland in there, or just shoot my crawfish oil in that hole, run it down the bank into the water, and then put some otter gland on a stick or a twig up high. Just kind of get two scents going. Both of those should be attractive to the otter. Another thing I'll do is, if there's not a great place, if there's not a good slide or run, I'll just kind of use a tile spade or use my foot, depending on how hard the bank is, and just put an indentation in that bank, so that it makes a perfect spot to set my number 5 bridger in, and then it also kind of narrows that otter down. If I've got my bank line, I've got the indentation, my trap here, and then a punch hole in right here. You know, naturally, the easiest way for him to get there, he can stay in the water the whole time, is going into that indentation to check it out, and he's going to have to go right over my trap. I've had a really good luck. I had one of my kind of trapping mentors from South Georgia. He showed me that using that crawfish oil, and man, ever since then, those are some things that I always carry with me. And if there's otters in the area, I'm going to make some sets like that with crawfish oil, and it's a really good way to catch raccoons too. If the otters don't come through pretty quick, you're going to wind up with some coons there. But once you kind of thin out the coons, you get back to catching or targeting your otters. So that's something that I really like to do, that kind of that punch hole set. Kind of like I said earlier, your biggest thing with targeting otters is time. So if you've got an area that you can set, you know there's otter sign, you can set it. The longer you can leave your sets in, the better. You know, if you get a couple otters come through, you catch them. If you can leave them there another month, you got good likelihood of catching. You know, if more of that group comes back through, or another group comes through, the longer, with good otter sign, the longer you can leave those traps there, the better your odds are of catching those otters. And it's like coyotes, just like anything else. You can set those traps, and the next day, the first day, you may catch them. They may have come through. But overall, time's your friend in otter trapping. Kind of wrapping up, one thing to keep in mind is otters are CITES animals, so they do have to have a CITES tag that's put on by your state wildlife department. And that's just, if I've covered this in previous podcasts, but CITE stands for Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. And it's basically a verification to end users, end buyers, that animal looks like other animals around the world that are maybe endangered or threatened, but that animal was harvested legally, and so it is safe to buy from that standpoint. It's not and so sea otter, or not sea otters, river otters, North American river otters, scientific name Otter canadensis, I do believe. They look like European otters, European river otters, or European otters, and then also like the giant. Is it the giant river otter or the giant South American river otter? Anyway, it's in Brazil in the Amazon. It's a giant river otter. Yeah, it's just a giant river otter that, or the giant otter that lives in South America. So they look like those otters, and those otter species, those otter populations are threatened or endangered. So as a way, bobcats are the same way. You know, there are a lot of spotted cats that are threatened or endangered. So it's kind of a hassle, but it's good from our standpoint, and helps. I think overall that, you know, we've got a way to signify to the end buyers that may be conscious of not wanting to be involved in any kind of black market trade or anything like that, any kind of trade that is going to further endanger a species. They can see that CITES tag and say, hey, that animal was harvested in North America. The tags usually even have the state on it, if you know the code, which is GA or FL or AR or whatever your state code is. But so they can look, say, you know, that animal was legally harvested in the United States in an area where otter populations are strong and there's no restricted harvest or limited restricted harvest. So we can sleep good at night knowing that we purchased that otter and we can make something really nice out of it, and we're not harming any wildlife populations in the process. So that was a little bit more long-winded than I expected, but just to wrap up on the CITES. And then closing out, for selling otters, if you're going to put your fur up, regardless of whether you're putting your fur up or not, you need to always keep in mind that otters can singe. Their fur can what's called singe, and so it's where the fur kind of curls. Instead of laying flat, it kind of curls up. And I don't know that you got to be trained, I would assume, to notice that, if you can even notice that with a naked eye, or if you have to have a microscope. But that is looked at by the fur buyers, and so it's good to keep your otters wet, at least moist, when you're working them. So if you throw them in the truck and you get home and he's dried off, if you're fixing to skin him and go ahead and flesh him right then, or skin him and throw him in the freezer, spritz him down with a bottle, spray bottle or something like that, just to wet that fur, because I think it's the heat from our body and the way that fur. I don't know exactly what causes it, but handling, touching your bare hand to dry otter fur can make it singe. So you want to take care of that. Be careful about that. Keep that pelt moist as much as you can. And then otters are actually sold, if you're putting them up, fleshing them and drying them, they're sold fur in. So just like a raccoon, you're going to cut out a window, and I don't know if that's so much to look at the hide, or maybe that's just to keep the fur from singeing even more. I'm not 100% sure on that. But regardless, you cut an inspection window so that a buyer can see a little bit more of the hide itself, or the fur itself on the inside. I think that pretty well covers everything that I wanted to hit on, my kind of notes here on talking to otters. Otters to me are right up there with coyotes in the fun of trapping, just because they roam like they do, and you never know when you're gonna catch them. So whenever I catch an otter, if you're watching along, man, I get super pumped up and excited when I catch one, just because it's kind of an extra special kind of Christmas morning scenario. If you're excited to make a catch, but even more excited because you weren't expecting it to be an otter. So hope you can take something away from that. If nothing else, if you think there might be otters in your area and you want to try to catch one, get you some crawfish oil, get you some good otter gland lure, because that will definitely help you. Anyway, I hope y'all are having a great summer, are getting ready for trapping season. National convention in Springfield, Missouri is right around the corner, and I'm going to be there. So be sure to let me know. I'll be there for sure Friday, it looks like. I may or may not be there Saturday too. We'll see about that. But if you're going to be there, hit me up, shoot me an email, DM me, leave me a comment. Let me know, because I'd like to holler at you and talk to you for a minute. I appreciate y'all following along, and y'all support all that you do. I was going to add, I don't have any of my, I've been doing some leather working stuff, but I'm back working on beaver tail wallets, and I've sold a few. So go check out my posts on Instagram and Facebook. DM me, message me, email me if you're interested in beaver tail wallets. I've been working on a few of those. I'll try to have some pictures to throw up next time to show you those, but I'm working on one right now. This is just the kind of the inside pockets. It's going to be a vertical wallet, and I think it's going to be really sharp. I'm pretty excited about getting back around to working on that stuff. So if you're interested in beaver tail stuff, shoot me a message, let me know, and I'll hook you up. Otherwise, y'all have a good summer. We'll talk to you next time.